Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Theology on the Rise. Today, there's only the three of us in the studio. Normally, we've got another guy on the couch, but that's because on the other side of the camera, we have someone very special. We'd like to either introduce you to if you don't know him, or just you get to get excited about the fact that we have Chad Bird on the show. Chad Bird. We are very excited. We are very excited to have Chad Bird on the other side. Where are you right now, Chad?
So I'm down in Texas. My wife and I live in East Texas, about 20 minutes from our grandkids. That's what brought us to East Texas. Good reason to be here. We love it here. Just a great home, great part of the state. So glad to be able to connect with you guys a little farther north than I am.
Yeah. And before, where were you, Chad? Tell us a little bit about, where you've been, your ministry, anything.
Sure. Yeah. So my wife and I we were both kind of raised in Texas, so we're native Texans. About a year ago, we moved to this part of the state. We were in the center of the state around Austin, San Antonio before that. But I've lived all over the place, New Mexico, Texas, Oklahoma, Colorado, Indiana, Ohio. So I joke that it was like I was on the run from the law for a while. I was moving so much. But I promise, no criminal background. It just happened to be positioning myself various places to teach, to work, and whatnot. But so I've got a background in teaching Old Testament Hebrew. Been doing that off and on my entire life. And been working for the nonprofit 1517 for, about 5 years now. Time flies. Just a wonderful, I tell everyone, everywhere I go to teach and to speak, I tell everyone it's a gift. I truly mean that. It's a gift to be able to do what I do, to be able to do full time what's my love and my passion, which is all centered around teaching the Old Testament teaching the gospel with an Old Testament accent. Whether it's my books or whether it's podcasts or in-person presentations or podcast, whatever it is, that's the center of what I do. So glad to be able to talk about that today with you guys.
Awesome. What can you tell us a little bit about 1517 and what that is?
I'd be happy to.
Oh yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say 1517 started several years ago before I was involved in them. Wanted the original organizers were centered around the teaching of Rod Rosenblatt and some others, and they wanted to start publishing some books and do a few in-person events. And then I and some of my friends who are now with 1517, we got connected with the organization back in 2016, and then heavily in 2017. Okay. And so they brought us on, and the nonprofits continue to expand. We have a number of full-time employees now, publishing house. We have big national and regional events, just a lot going on with our podcast network and everything else that we're doing. We're just basically trying to get the gospel out there in as many ways as we possibly can, especially in the ways that people consume information and articles and ideas today. So we do a lot of social media work, do a lot of podcasts, videos, and things of that nature. So grateful to be part of an organization where Christ is at the center, the gospel is at the center of everything that we do.
Amen. Yeah, that's incredible. Every so often I'll preach somewhere, and I often use some of 1517's resources to help me just go through the lectionary readings, that kind of thing. So I've used your podcast before. Is it 40 Minutes in the Old Testament?
Yes. Yeah.
And then I often use the other one, Craft of Preaching, quite a bit, going through some of those things. So
absolutely. We have just a wealth of resources. We tell everyone almost all of them are free except the books. You do have to buy the books.
Shoot.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we don't send you free books. Almost everything else
you did. So.
In your case, we made an exception. Made an exception for you guys, so you could have in hand the Christ key.
Yeah.
So
thank you, by the way. Yeah, thanks.
You're welcome.
Welcome. Today we're going to get into a topic that I personally have not done a ton of research into before preparing for this episode? You guys, I don't know, maybe Seth did a little bit more.
Not nearly as much as
Yes.
Chad. So really exciting.
I've dabbled occasionally, but this is the first time that I've really like gotten into the topic. So
the topic is Christology in the Old Testament. Chad, could you explain a little bit about what we mean by that? Like, what is Christology?
I would be happy to. So Christology is just a big word. That's all about the teaching and the study of who Christ is, basically. So, of course, Jesus himself, you could say, initiated this when he said to his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" Yeah, what's their Christology, we might say. And of course, he got various answers, and Peter gave the right one: "You're the Christ, the Son of the living God." So, yeah, that's basically what Christology is. I mean, there's a lot more to it, but that's basically what we're talking about. So who is Jesus? Is he just a first century Jewish rabbi from Galilee who went around teaching and doing great things? Is he something much more than that? Of course, that's a Christian confession, that he indeed was a first century Jewish rabbi who was from Galilee and went around doing wonderful things, but he's much more than that. He's not just a man, he's also at the same time God. So when we're talking about Christology, we're talking about who Christ is, who Jesus of Nazareth is. Now, typically when we're talking about Christology, also people associate that with the New Testament, and understandably so, and rightly so. I mean, you got the four Gospels, you've got Paul's letters, you've got the entire New Testament, which in one way or another is teaching us about who Jesus is, unpacking his mission, his ministry, his identity. Now, what I try and do in my teaching is, of course, to do that, but also to ask kind of a follow-up question. You might say, well, who do the prophets say that you are? Who do the Psalms say that you are? Who does Moses say that you are? Because ultimately, what we're doing when we look at the person of Christ is we take the title Christ. It's not his last name, of course, Jesus Christ. Christ is his title. The Hebrew equivalent of that would be the Mashiach, which means the anointed, we say, the Messiah. Well, that itself is sending us directly back to the Old Testament. So who is the Messiah, and what else is he called, and how does the Old Testament, beginning in Genesis, the first book of the Bible, how does the Old Testament both prophesy who he is to be and prefigure who he is to be? Kind of got typology going on there. But also, where do we see him? It's kind of the three P's: prophesy, and then foreshadow or give some sort of prefigurement of him. But also, and this is my favorite topic, how is Christ also present?
Yeah.
So how is he present, prefigured, and prophesied? I think most Christians are used to hearing about messianic prophecies, whether it's where he's to be born or Palm Sunday prophecy, these things. And they're probably familiar with prefigurement in the sense of Adam, or maybe Moses or Joshua or David being a black and white portrait that Christ fills in full color when he comes. Now, thinking about him as being actually present in the Old Testament, that is where people are most unfamiliar. And for my part, that's where we actually have the richest territory to explore. And of course, we can do some of that in our conversation today. But when we're talking about Christology, most people think, oh, New Testament. I would say yes, but Old Testament as well.
yeah.
Was this sort of always an area of study that struck your fancy, or has this been a growing love over the years as you've kind of delved into the books?
I would say that when I fell in love with the Old Testament, which happened for me during seminary, it was then really that I locked into Old Testament Christology, and I've never really left. I had a professor in seminary who opened my eyes in kind of a Emmaus Road kind of experience.
Okay. Oh yeah.
To where you see Christ talked about in Moses and the prophets and the Psalms and throughout the Old Testament. And once kind of the scales fell from my eyes and I was able to see Christ all over the pages of the Old Testament, and then had the realization that this is something that not all Christians are aware of, then that ignited a fire within me, which still blazes strong today. So this happened to me when I was in my early to mid 20s, and continues really to be both my passion and really the goal of much of my writing and teaching today.
Cool. Yeah, it's so interesting. Like we said before, you sent us a copy of your book, and a few days ago, and in the past few weeks, we've been looking at that book, looking at some other resources, and it's so interesting how, like you said, so many Christians will talk about the prophecies of Jesus as Christology, as the study of Christ, right? Who is Christ in the Old Testament? But you take it a step further to say, no, Christ is actually present in the Old Testament. And yeah, could you talk a little bit about that? Like, where we see Christ present in the Old Testament?
Sure. I think to begin kind of think along those lines, one of the things I like to point out is, so we have this, it's a seeming contradiction in the Old Testament, because you'll have passages that say no one can see God and live. And then you'll have other passages where God is seen and people live.
Yeah.
And one of the things you begin to notice, beginning with Hagar, you have this with a lot of other figures in the Old Testament, like the parents of Samson. They're like surprised when they have this divine appearance before them, and then it's over, and they're like, "Oh, I'm still alive."
Yeah.
I'm not supposed to be able to survive this. How did this work?
That's right. Yeah.
So which is it? I mean, can you see God and live, or can you not see God and live? Well, the answer is that what God does. Well, first of all, you can't see God in all of his glory, because that would destroy people. So what God does is, in a variety of ways, he accommodates himself to the human ability to see him, to interact with him. In one case, Genesis 18, to actually have a meal with him when he appears to Abraham. Most of the time, he appears alone in some sort of visual form, whether that's as a man, as he appears to Jacob when he wrestles with Jacob in Genesis 32, or he appears as this flame of fire in the burning bush in Exodus chapter 3. He appears again as a man to the parents of Samson. I would argue that he appears sometimes as a visible manifestation of the word of the Lord. And we have examples of that in the call of Samuel, the call of Jeremiah, as well as Genesis 15, when the word of the Lord appears to Abram and talks to him and leads him outside.
Yeah.
So sometimes he appears as the word, sometimes as fire, sometimes, in fact, a lot of times, he appears as a human being. So God has temporarily assumed a physical, visual, we might say even tangible form, in order that he can be seen, that he can talk with people, he can admonish them, give them instructions, send them on a mission, whatever it might be. So these are what I would call Christophanies. So these are appearances of Christ in the Old Testament. Now, the verse I like to go to when we're talking about this in general is John chapter 1, verse 18, where we read, "No one has seen God at any time." Now, it's very Old Testament when John says that. No one has seen God at any time. But John doesn't stop there. He goes on to say, "But the only begotten God, who's in the bosom of the Father, has made him known."
Right.
Now, in Greek, that word for "made him known" is where we get our word for exegesis. So the Son of God has exegeted, interpreted, explained, revealed, made known the Father. And that's not only in the incarnation, but that's from the beginning onward. So we have the Son appearing in these various kinds of ways to teach us about who God is and to teach us, to reveal the Father to us.
That's wonderful.
Yeah. The one, so when you say like the word is appearing to people in the Old Testament, the question that comes to mind is, okay, so when John starts his gospel with the word became flesh and dwelt among us, is that a reference to that Old Testament word that we see present as like Christ in the Old Testament? Or is that in reference to something else? Like what would you say to that?
Yeah. So here's the way I like to think about this. So let's imagine that we're friends. We're living in the first century. We're Jews, and we're friends with John. And we walk in one day, and John has this blank sheet of parchment in front of him. And we say to him, "What are you doing? Looks like you're going to write something." He's like, "Yeah, I think I'm going to write down everything that I know and have experienced about Jesus. I'm going to write a gospel." We're like, "Oh, that's a great idea. How are you going to start? How are you going to begin?" And he says something like, "Well, I want to do something different than Matthew, Mark, and Luke did. I want to get right to the heart of who Jesus is." And in this imaginary conversation we're having with him, we might say, well, then, I mean, there's various options that you might have. For instance, John could have, and maybe we would suggest this to him, he could have begun by saying, in the beginning was wisdom, and that wisdom was with God, and that wisdom was God. Or he could have started out, in the beginning was the messenger of the Lord, and that messenger of the Lord was with God, and that messenger was God. Or he could have begun, in the beginning was glory, and that glory was with God, and that glory was God. So there's a variety of different ways that John could have begun his gospel. Of course, he narrowed in on the word, in Greek, the logos. Now, the reason that John did that is because I don't think it's because of kind of the Greco-Roman world and the philosophical talk about the logos. I think that John is directly reflecting Old Testament text, where you have in Hebrew, the devar, which is the Hebrew word for word, the devar Yahweh, the word of the Lord, who is appearing to people. Now, when we hear the word, of course, we're thinking ears, not eyes. Words are something you hear. Unless it's printed, it's not something that you see. But there are these various stories in the Old Testament where the word of the Lord makes himself a visual word, such as the occasions that I talked about. And I would argue that actually helps to explain a lot of what we hear later in the prophets when we see the word of the Lord came to Isaiah, or the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah, or the word of the Lord came to any of the prophets. In the past, I thought of that as, the prophet hears this word coming down from heaven and he writes whatever he hears. And I'm not saying that's not possible, but I suspect a lot of times what's happening here is the Son of the Father is appearing to prophets and he's talking to them. This is the word coming to prophets, speaking to them, just like he did any number of times from Genesis onward.
Right. So then John is very clearly trying to draw that parallel. It's like he wants you to read John and realize, oh, we're talking about the word of God that appeared to Moses, that appeared to Elijah, that appeared to all these people, because he's writing this to Jews. And
Yes.
Jews understand this. So they're going to make that connection in their minds.
That's awesome.
Really interesting.
Yeah, it's so interesting.
Yeah, I think that's his motivation. John, of course, knows his audience. He knows that his audience knows the Old Testament. I mean, obviously, that's the way he begins in such a way as to clearly echo Genesis 1:1 in the beginning.
Yeah.
In fact, if you look at the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, it begins the same way as John 1:1 starts out. In arche, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's Genesis. In arche, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God, John 1:1. So John is wanting us immediately in our minds, when we hear the beginning of his gospel, to take a trip back to Genesis 1 and to understand that already in Genesis 1 at the creation, who was there? The Son of the Father. And the Son of the Father, as the Word, with the Spirit, were, as Irenaeus would say, the two hands of God by which the Father crafted all things. So John very much knows his audience, and he knows that by the time that John is writing, I mean, even before Jesus came, even before the incarnation, you had in the Jewish mindset an understanding that there was a complexity within God. The Jews of the Old Testament were not Unitarians; they were monotheists, one God, but they understood there to be a a complexity within God, because there's God. There's also God who has his spirit. The Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. There's God who sends his divine messenger or his word or his name or the Son of Man in order to accomplish things. So, yeah, there was what scholars often refer to as a complex monotheism that was part and parcel of the understanding of God among Jews in the first century. And so John's connecting with his audience in that way by talking about the Messiah as the Word.
That's so cool. It's like we're talking about the Trinity right there. John is referencing. Yeah. Here's the Trinity. So cool.
I have a question that's kind of been ruminating for me. Would you, because as we were reading these books, I was wondering, would you go as far to say that anytime there's sort of a physical, temporal manifestation of God's presence, that is
like the sun,
the pre-incarnate Son? Like the burning bush comes to mind, and then is it Paul in Corinthians that talks about Christ as that rock that that Moses strikes, where the water comes forth? There certainly seems to be that idea. Is that something that you're echoing? Could you say something a little more about that?
Yeah. Actually, I would 100% affirm that, with one exception, and this is from the book of Daniel, chapter 7, where you have the famous Son of Man scene, where you have the Ancient of Days, and then you have the Son of Man. So with that one exception, when you have what we call theophanies in the Old Testament, God appearances, that in fact what you're really seeing, with that one exception, is a Christ appearance, is a Christophany. And this, takes all kinds of different forms, as we've been discussing. But yeah, one of these is, we haven't talked about it yet, but is usually translated the angel of the Lord. And I don't like that translation. The Hebrew there is malach. The Hebrew malach is translated as angel, but malach just means messenger. It doesn't mean a messenger. I mean, it doesn't mean an angel. I mean, it can be an angelic messenger. It can also be a human messenger. In fact, the last book of the Old Testament, Malachi, in Hebrew, malachi just means my malach, my messenger, which of course in this case is obviously a human being. Malachi is a human messenger of God. But there's also this very unique messenger in the Old Testament that is usually called either the Malach Yahweh, the messenger of Yahweh, or the Malach Elohim, the messenger of God. Now, what sets him apart, and the reason that we know this is not an ordinary messenger, is that anytime he shows up, he is received as God. He's called God. In fact, he calls himself God. He doesn't just let other people call it. He calls himself God. He receives worship. He speaks with first person singular, I, divine authority. So that's the Trinitarian beauty, a number of these passages, because what's going on is you have a messenger from the Lord who shows up. So there's obviously a distinction going on here, right? Because the messenger and the Lord can't be exactly the same. I send a messenger, so the messenger is obviously distinct from me. So the Lord sends a messenger. And then when the messenger shows up, he's called the Lord and God. Yeah. So if you don't have the Trinitarian framework, you're like, what's going on here?
Yeah.
Who is he? Is he a messenger or is he the Lord? And Christians say, yes.
Yeah.
So is Jesus just sent from the Father? Is Jesus just sent from God, or is he God? And Christians say, yes, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. And so examples like that are kind of what you mean when you talk about that complex monotheism, and that's what the Jews and those who studied the Old Testament, when they started to develop this idea of a complex monotheism, they would look to those passages as examples of that.
Yes, yeah. You even had something developing among the rabbis prior to the coming of Jesus, where there was it's called two powers. So this is all based upon Daniel 7 that I've already talked about a couple times, where you have the Son of Man appearing. Now, there's a significant plural noun that's used in that section of Daniel, we're told that not a throne, but thrones were set up. So when the rabbis would talk about this, you had a throne for the Ancient of Days, but you also had a throne for the Son of Man who comes. And so you had what's usually referred to as the two powers controversy. It was a controversy, though, only after the Christian church began to teach that the Son of Man in Daniel chapter 7 is in fact Jesus the Messiah. So here's what happens. Prior to the incarnation and prior to the preaching of the Christian gospel, a lot of Jews believed that in fact you did have two powers in heaven. You had this Son of Man with one throne. You had the Ancient of Days with one throne. And then when Christians began to say, oh yeah, you know who the Son of Man is? You know who's on the other throne? It's Jesus of Nazareth, whom you crucified, who was resurrected. And then what begins to happen is you have rabbis who begin to distance themselves from the two powers teaching, and then eventually they actually declare it heretical. And they declare it heretical because this is being basically used by the Christians to teach Christology.
Right.
So the point is, prior to the incarnation, prior to the Son of Man actually coming among us, many Jews believed that, in fact, there was a throne for the Messiah, a throne for the Ancient of Days, and then they began to distance themselves from that. So yeah, this is how, for instance, Thomas could look at Jesus, obviously a man, and say to him, my Lord and my God.
Yeah.
This was not like a far reach for a Jewish monotheist of the first century, because theologically their minds had already been readied for this confession by all of these Old Testament texts that led up to this understanding of what we confess to be the Trinity.
So cool. Do we see any of the other New Testament writers sort of alluding to this controversy about the two powers?
No, I don't think we see any New Testament writers alluding to the controversy. I mean, so the controversy only really came about after the Christian message began to be preached. Right. So this is especially so if you've heard of the name Rabbi Akiba. Rabbi Akiba was a famous rabbi, well known, well respected toward the end of the first century AD, and then into really the second century. And there's a later Jewish text which corrects him, says basically he was wrong about the two powers, because of course by now it's like it's kind of like Isaiah 53. It's like it's a text that those who don't espouse Jesus as the Messiah don't really know what to do with, because it is so blatantly Jesus centered. And so also Daniel 7 came to be that same way also.
That's so cool. It's so interesting, because I remember like as a teenager thinking about this question of like, is the angel of the Lord or like the messenger of the Lord, is that Jesus? And my youth pastor also struggled with that question. He was like, I don't know, right? I don't know for sure. So it's so cool to hear you talking about this, and it's just blowing my mind.
Yeah. Well, go ahead. I'll let you ask your question. I was going to bring up another text that kind of helps to explain that.
Yeah. Well, I would love it if you brought up that text. My question here is like, okay, now I'm thinking about like Adam walking with God. We talked about this a little while ago.
Yeah.
Is that?
I was just going to bring that up.
Yeah. Is that also? Would that be the presence of Christ walking with Adam, or is that God? Just like, what is your perspective on that?
Yeah, so I would group that text along with all the others, where when you have a physical manifestation of God or a visual manifestation of God, the God who cannot be seen, who is seen, then that is the Son of the Father, who is walking in the garden in the cool of the day, calling out, Adam, Adam, where are you? Now, when you have that understanding, just think about the implications of that.
Yes. So my goodness. Oh my goodness sakes. Yeah. It just hit me. Wow.
This is wild, because we're sitting in Genesis 3.
Yeah.
We've got. We'll say Jesus, just to make it simple. Here's Jesus walking in the garden in the cool of the day, calling out for Adam, and then of course we have the conversation between him and Adam and Eve, and then what does he do?
Yeah.
He speaks to the serpent. And this is kind of a cool thing too. So the very first prophecy of the Messiah, Genesis 3:15, I will put enmity between you and the woman. The very first prophecy is spoken actually to the devil. So,
Yeah, interesting.
yeah, I'm going to put enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head and you shall bruise his heel, or however you want to translate that. It's the same verb in Hebrew for both actions. It's kind of hard to capture in one English word. But yeah, the one who speaks that is the one who will do that.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Wow.
he could, as it were, be talking to Satan. He shall bruise your head and you shall bruise his heel. But at the same time, kind of did this sideline glance over at Adam and Eve and pointed himself.
Yeah.
I'm the dude.
Yeah,
I'm the
I'm the
seed.
Yeah.
I'm the one who's going to do this. So
Wow.
the Messiah speaks the first messianic prophecy. It's self-referential.
Yes. Yeah.
One of these days, speaking directly to Satan, one of these days, my heel will crush your head, and your fangs will sink into my heel, so that you think you're getting the upper hand. Actually, by death I shall destroy death. And by that action, you, O serpent, O devil, shall be destroyed.
Yeah.
It's huge implication.
That is absolutely incredible.
It'll
I mean,
click.
it clicked in a moment. Yeah. Well, because what made me go whoa was what is Jesus referred to sometimes? The new Adam. So you have the new Adam there with the old Adam. So what you have is when he goes down there and says and calls out, Adam, where are you? When he's appearing in that pre-incarnate way, but physically, it's like it's already all written, and it's already everything is lined up, and he's there at the moment of Adam's sin, pre-incarnate, but physically in the garden with Adam, there to make that promise and there to say to the devil, the day is coming. I'm gonna put you down. So it's just that image of the old Adam and the new Adam together in the garden is, there in the moment of the fall of humanity's condemnation, humanity's salvation is there.
Yeah. It just underscores the point that the impulse of Jesus has always been not to turn away from sinners, but to go towards sinners.
Yeah.
That's what we see in his ministry in the Gospels. That's what we see already in his ministry in Genesis chapter 3. He goes to where the sinners are, and he steps in to do that which is necessary in order to save them. What he did in Genesis 3 is basically in miniature what he's going to be doing throughout his ministry in the Gospels.
So incredible. Yeah, this just seeing the presence of Christ in the Old Testament just meshes the Bible together so well. It's an incredible book.
Yeah. I think this is something that needs to be talked about more, because I think so often you have a couple of problems that I think sometimes arise with Christians, where you'll hear a lot of Christians say, I'm a New Testament Christian because I like Jesus and
Old Testament God and the New Testament.
That they're different. And you'll have skeptics look at the whole Bible and say, the God that is being presented in the Old Testament is so obviously of a different temperament and character than the one being presented in the New Testament. But when you study and you have this understanding of Christology, you realize, no, it is like this Jesus in the New Testament is appearing in the Old Testament. And that, like you say, Nathan, it kind of, I think a proper understanding of that can really help to distill or to do away with some of those criticisms and those concerns that Christians have sometimes about the God as he appears in the Old Testament as this avenging figure. It is not the case that we have an Old Testament God and a New Testament God. It's the same God in across the whole Bible.
And it just gives you so much, like, it's just so cool to see Christ so involved in this story.
Yeah.
You know, like with Adam, he references Adam over and over again in the Gospels, and how we need a new Adam. He was there. He was there in the garden with Adam. And it's just so cool to see how much he does care. He's in this story. Yeah, it's so cool.
Yeah, I think it does help to it helps people to understand that we're not dealing here with two different stories. You got the Old Testament story, the Old Testament God, New Testament story, New Testament God. No, you got the same God throughout. I mean, of course, what you're referring to, people who think there's a different God, they're actually, I mean, they're echoing what was spoken by Marcion, early church heretic. But I think most people are kind of, not most people, a lot of people are still kind of functioning Marcionist, and that they have this view of God as if he evolved into a nicer God by the time he gets to the New Testament. He's always been a God of law and gospel, of justice and mercy. Yeah. I mean, that's exactly, if you look at Revelation, that's exactly how Jesus is portrayed there. He's a God of mercy, but he's also a God of justice, because he's God, and that's who God is. He's a God of law and he's a God of gospel, and so sinners need the law, but they also need mercy, and that's how Jesus has always dealt with us.
Yeah, and I think especially for Lutherans, this is an interesting topic to talk about, just the Old Testament and Christ being in the Old Testament, because I have found quite a bit in the Lutheran Church, the gospel text is often preached on a Sunday morning because we're presenting the gospel and preaching, and it's so good, right? We just want to get the gospel message out clearly to people through the gospels. But the gospel is in the Old Testament, right? This promise of a Messiah, this promise, Christ is right there in the Old Testament. And it's so cool to, just look at the Old Testament a little bit more, because I feel like it's often not where we go first, especially just in preaching on a Sunday morning.
I think part of the issue with us is, our ears are tuned kind of the frequency of the New Testament. And so when we hear the gospel in the New Testament, we're like, oh yeah, that's good news. But if we retune our ears to also hear the frequency of the Old Testament gospel, then we realize it's actually all over the place. All over the place we hear about the goodness and the mercy, the long suffering, the fidelity of God. And even the way in which the Messiah is going to bring about our salvation is preached throughout the Old Testament. We have it, of course, prominent in Isaiah. But we're just not so used to hearing it in that Old Testament sort of way that we don't always hear it. But we don't have four Gospels. We have Gospels all over. Isaiah is a Gospel. I would argue Leviticus is a Gospel. Genesis is a Gospel, in the sense that they're all proclaiming to us in their own unique way the good news of our salvation in the work of the Son of God on our behalf.
Yeah. Totally. Sorry, I thought you were going to say something.
No, I was just processing.
Yeah.
So, Chad, having studied Christology for so long, and you clearly know the topic very well, kind of a practical, like, what is it? How does this affect the lives of people, understanding proper Christology? Kind of a question like that. So we've talked a little bit about some of the benefits. I mean, it's just kind of been our minds have just been blowing this whole time because of that richness that comes about from understanding Christ's presence in the Old Testament. The incredible richness that comes from that is incredibly beautiful and beneficial. And then we touched a little bit on, how a proper understanding of Christology in the Old Testament can help to sort of, again, bridge and help people to realize, oh, this is like a complete picture and not the old God and the new God, But what are some of the other, like, how does this change people? How does this affect people, knowing this topic? And like, you've probably seen it, having taught for so long, and maybe people come up to you after your presentations and are like, this has just like changed everything for me. Like some stories maybe.
Yeah, it's funny you asked that, because so just this weekend, before we started recording, I mentioned that I'd been down in Birmingham, Alabama to talk about this very topic. And I had two young men come up to me after the conference who had been struggling with the Old Testament. They said they'd been reading Genesis and didn't just didn't really know what to make of it. They loved the New Testament, loved the Psalms, for instance, but just didn't know what to make of Genesis. And both of them said the exact same thing, that this had revolutionized their understanding of the Old Testament now. And it revolutionizes it because Jesus revolutionizes everything. I mean, once you get the fact that God is not against you, that God is for you, that God loves you, that God made everything in the world for you. In fact, once you get that God actually likes you and has always wanted to be there with you and for you, to save you, to deliver you, and that the God who does this is not some kind of generic deity in the skies, but is in fact Jesus, the Son of God, that this has been the divine impulse from the very beginning, not to condemn sinners, but rather to rescue them. And that Jesus shows up to do this time and time again, to unveil his heart that is pulsating with mercy from Genesis onward. Once you realize that, all of a sudden the Bible becomes this univocal witness to our God who is long-suffering, gracious, merciful, and wanting, desiring, and willing, and engaging in the very act of saving sinners. And once you understand that, all of a sudden you realize the entire witness of the Scriptures is that God isn't against us, that he's for us, and will do whatever it takes to save us and to make us his own.
Right from the beginning, he's been for us.
Reminds me of, I don't know if it's Mere Christianity or wherever C.S. Lewis, talks about, in order to relate to the story and the characters of an author's book, he's got to write himself into the book. And that's the case with God. He loves the story, he loves the narrative, and he loves the characters. And so he writes himself into the story.
Yep.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way to think about it. He's I always like to joke and say it's not as if Jesus, throughout the Old Testament, every day was saying to his Father, "Is today when I can go down and visit the people?" He said, "No." Right. Well, what if today? Can I go down and visit? No, you got to wait. You got to wait till first century, then you can do that. No, from the very beginning.
Just a millennium.
Jesus, from the very beginning, Jesus shows up because that's where he wants to be. He writes himself into the story from the very beginning, and then writes us into his story, so that we become part of the body of Christ, and those who are no longer estranged, but those who are brought near by the blood of Christ and chosen, accepted by the Father.
Yeah, often we talk on this channel about how good theology will always lead you to the cross, to the resurrection. And this is one of those things that very clearly does that, right? It's we see Jesus in the Old Testament. I think you call it in your book, having little dress rehearsals for the incarnation. And he's preparing himself for the cross, preparing us for the cross. And this theology just leads us so clearly to Jesus. Jesus has died for you. He was risen so that death is defeated, and we're able to now be part of that story. We always were part of that story, but to be a little bit closer, I guess, with Christ. Do you guys have any other questions? Do you have anything else you want to say on this topic? We kind of touched on one aspect of Christology. There's so much more to it. Prophecies. We could talk about David and all those different things, and we won't get to that today. But any other comments, questions?
Well, maybe we should. The book that we've been kind of operating from is, of course, it's Chad Bird's, and it's called The Christ Key. And I mean, as you can see, this clearly was so beneficial for us. So whoever's watching, I highly recommend this book. It's accessible, but it's incredibly rich too. I thought we forgot to do that, so I thought I'd just mention that now.
You popped off with that book, Chad.
Well, thank you.
You did great.
Yeah, that book has been growing within me for a long time. So I was glad to finally get it out and get it there on paper. It's really, I mean, it's not like the end all and be all of this topic. I really view the Christ Key as, okay, here's a map by which you can understand the Old Testament landscape. and you can then see where Christ is everywhere. Or if you want to use the metaphor of the title itself, here's the key that unlocks the door of Genesis, unlocks the door of, it's the master key, unlocks Exodus, Leviticus, you name it, in order that you can walk into these books and see Christ portrayed there, present there, prophesied there as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and if you want to know more about this topic, I'm sure you've got lots more on your own channel, Chad, that we could direct people to.
Well, I think one thing in particular that might be helpful to people, I've taught 2 online courses on this topic through the 1517 Academy. So just go to our website, 1517.org. You can find 1517 Academy there. We have a number of courses. They're all free. And I've taught a shorter one and a longer one on this topic. So you can look those up. And so if you're interested, you can, I think the first one's maybe 6 or 7 lectures. The next one is more lectures, a little bit more in depth. So if you're really into this topic and want to find out more, then check out the book, The Christ Key, or the Christ in the Old Testament classes at 1517 Academy.
Cool. Yeah, we'll link the website for sure. Maybe the classes, if we can figure it out, in the YouTube video description.
Yeah, that'd be great. That'd be great. Thanks.
Okay, I have to check that one out.
Yeah,
That's awesome.
yeah, it sounds great.
Yeah.
Well, awesome. Thank you for joining us. Sorry, any other comments before we?
Oh,
none
good.
here.
I got to go to class right away.
Oh yeah, Seth is on his way to class.
Yeah. Well, thank you for the invitation. It's been a wonderful conversation. So I appreciate you having me on.
Thanks, guys, for watching this episode of Theology on the Rise. We will see you next time.
Blessings.
Take care. Wow, thank you, Chad. That was awesome.
Oh, thank you guys. That was wonderful.